Hey, 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 welcome on this beautiful day. I think summer has arrived. I am so excited. Hello, Nick. How are you?
You know, Emma, I'm all fired up, ready for action. I'm going to be as high voltage as I can possibly be to be as entertaining as possible, whilst imparting lots of useful information to help people with their stamp duty issues.
Fantastic. We love that. We love that. So if anyone missed, I interviewed Nick a couple of weeks ago. So Nick Garner, who is an incredible person to talk to if you want to reclaim your stamp duty. And that can be a really hefty chunk of money when purchasing a property. So it's really, really key that we start to understand this. So what we did in the interview a couple of weeks ago, so do go and have a look if you haven't listened already, is we went really deep dived into all of the all of the knowledge behind stamp duty and how you can potentially claim it back or pay less. And what we're going to do today is actually put that into practice. So we're going to be looking at properties, we're going to be looking at pictures, and we're going to be able to start ourselves learning how we can start spotting things that may enable us to have some reduction on the stamp duty. So Nick, just a quick one for anyone new who didn't listen a couple of weeks ago. Please introduce yourself to anyone who doesn't know you.
Hi, I'm me, Nick Garner, and I'm founder of Stamp Duty Advice Bureau. There are 15 of us in the business now, and we specialize in stamp duty. We're getting into land and building tax, Scottish revenue tax, and land transaction tax matters with Wales, Welsh Revenue Authority. But anyway, we are a one-trick pony, as it were, which is it's land tax, stamp duty, and so on. And our main agenda is to help people understand the topic. So I've written 2 books on the topic, a monster book, which is in total over 1,000 pages. It's too long. But anyway, I've also written a shorter book, which is essentially a summary guide to the essentials of stamp duty, and it just gives you the very basics. But anyway, the way we make our income as a business is through advice and reclaims. And the biggest block of, if you think about overpaid stamp duty, I've done some data analysis on this. It's about 1.7 billion pounds in overpaid stamp duty a year that has occurred. And the reason it happens is because conveyancing solicitors say, well, that's a house. You're paying residential rates, dear investor. And there's no real discussion about that. And conveyancing solicitor will also say, well, I'm not a tax expert. Sorry, go to a tax expert. And then you end up in a kind of roundabout circle. And in the meantime, people end up overpaying. And there's something like 30,000 properties a year where people have overpaid stamp duty due to property condition only. And I'm not talking about misapplied stamp duty reliefs or LTT reliefs or LBTT reliefs, just property condition. So
okay, so just to clarify that, so basically you're saying that 30,000 properties, due to them being of a certain condition, should have not paid stamp duty, or
correct.
should have had a reduction.
Should have paid less, should have paid the correct amount of stamp duty.
So they should have gone from residential being a perfectly fine property that you can move into and there's nothing really wrong with it. And what we're looking at is properties that, although people may be living there, are deemed not appropriate for human habitation. Correct. So therefore should be on a commercial stamp duty rate. Is that correct?
Non-residential stamp duty rate. Sorry, it's all about the detail, but that's why people gravitate to us, because we're fastidious about these things. So commercial, it's not actually a thing. It's non-residential. So the main idea behind this is that I'll just go back one step. So there are something like 600,000 residential properties sold every year. And then within that, there are a segment of higher rate properties subject to higher rate stamp duty. And the vast majority, probably 90% of these, relate to companies buying property. And these are landlords, buy-to-let investors, developers, whoever. And they pay the higher rate stamp duty of 3%. And the way the legislation works is that in the Finance Act 2003, there's a definition of what a dwelling is, and it's not. It's subject to debate. And whenever there's a debate, there's generally, you could say there's a court case in the end. And in this instance, there was a court case with PN Bewley, who is a developer, and HMRC back in 2019. And the question in hand was, if property is habitable, should it be assessed as residential for stamp duty purposes? Because a dwelling is a place you can dwell in. And if you can't dwell in a dwelling, then it's not residential, is it?
Yeah.
So it could be an office, it could be a garage, whatever, but it's certainly not a place to live. And so the objective today is to go into all of this in more detail so that you can objectively understand, was that property that I bought actually a dwelling technically? And remember, we're in the world of tax and law and definitions and so on. Anyway, with the court case, what they found was that the property was not habitable and therefore should not have been assessed as residential for stamp duty purposes. And thus it was non-residential. And non-residential stamp duty rates are lower for property investors who have paid higher rate stamp duty, or if you're an owner-occupier and your property was purchased for more than £1 million, then also you've got an economic incentive to reclaim that overpaid stamp duty. And so a lot of this, I guess, or a lot of what we're going to do is just really understand what the parameters are.
Brilliant. And once we go through this, just as a feedback, if anyone's got any questions when we're in the thick of this, especially, you might see a property that looks similar to something that you've got, for instance, that you had no idea about. If you're listening live, obviously do make a comment. But if you're not listening live, then also do make a comment and we'll be able to come back to you and let you know, clarify that situation as well. And obviously we'll give you some contact details later on. So yeah, do feel free to ask any questions.
So my mission for today is to make this one of the most useful things you've seen in a long time, if your property was a bit of a wreck when you purchased it. So whenever I'm talking to clients, I go through the usual qualifiers. And the first one is, did you buy it in the last 4 years, if it's England or Northern Ireland? If it's Wales, it's 4 years. And if it's Scotland, it's 5 years. Did you pay higher rate stamp duty? Now, bearing in mind, without digressing too much, we'll concentrate on England, Northern Ireland, but just be aware that in Wales, higher rate stamp duty is 4% of the property value. Scotland, it's 6%. And we are doing some test cases with Wales and Scotland. So we'll see how they go. I'm reasonable. Well, we'll see. I can't say I'm confident or not, but the legislation, the legislation, the acknowledgement of certain court cases as being relevant to understanding the legislation are still applicable. So basically it all shapes up. Anyway, right. So the next thing is 4 years, higher rate. And a very simple question might be, when you bought that property as an investor, could you have rented it out the next day? And if you say no, then we're into the next question, which is, okay, what were the condition issues?
And
So,
also, just a quick clarity on that one.
yes.
There may be people living in there, but it may not be appropriate for them to be living. So, for instance, I'm purchasing a property at the moment, and I found some things that are very disconcerting about this property, and there are people living in there.
Yeah.
I personally wouldn't rent it out in that condition. So again, just because there is somebody living in there doesn't necessarily, am I correct in saying, doesn't necessarily
Absolutely.
mean that it still constitutes a dwelling?
Yeah, so then you're into Home Fitness for Habitation Act 2018, and the question being, is that a decent home? A home with decent. So they have the decent home standard, and is it a decent home? And actually, this arcs back to this whole business about habitability. So broadly, the arguments. So I'll just quickly take it from the top, as in how it all fits together, and then we talk about property condition. The next thing is, right, so you have the qualifiers, you then have the arguments in which we go to HMRC with, and they are broadly not habitable, as in various condition issues, and we argue PN Bewley versus HMRC, which we talked about, where PN Bewley won that case. Then we talk about HHSRS, which is Housing Health and Safety Rating System. And this is very important because it's used as a frame of reference for the Home Fitness for Habitation Act and also the Decent Home Standard. And essentially, it's a quantifiable approach to risk in the home or to hazardous condition issues that make a property uninhabitable. So, Emma, your property that you're interested in has probably got lots of these kind of issues. And under the Homes Act 2004, Section 20 and 21, the local authority, or a local authority, has the power to issue what's known as a prohibition notice on a property. So in other words, if it has these condition hazards, it could be legally banned from use as a dwelling. In HMRC guidance, what they say is that if a property, if a local authority had cause to issue a prohibition notice on a property, then HMRC would accept that that is not habitable and thus should be assessed as non-residential. It's only one line in their guidance, but it's been there for 8 years, so it's a keeper, as it were. And this is the foundation of our cases. So what we're arguing is that if a property could have been legally restricted from use, then we would say that's not a habitable property.
Fantastic. So again, just to clarify,
yes.
So what we're saying is you can buy a property. It can be a bit of a state, but you may still have a tenant in there. You then it could be deemed as, hazardous conditions. It doesn't necessarily mean that the building is shut down, but it means at that moment it would be considered a non-dwelling, even though somebody's dwelling in it. Non-dwelling, which could reduce your stamp duty.
Yeah, roughly speaking. So take the story with the tenant. Okay, so the tenant is being very nice about it all, and the tenant could contact the local authority and say, please come and inspect my property. There's damp, there's mold, whatever. And the local authority inspector would come around, do an HHSRS inspection, which is basically a hazards inspection. And it's different from a RICS inspection, which is basically a survey to determine overall condition. It's there's a lot of crossover, but one is HHSRS is hazards, RICS is RICS level 2 or whatever is general condition. And we use RICS surveys all the time to highlight various condition hazards. And we're going to have a look at some of this a little later on in some real live actual cases that we've
Great.
done.
When should we look into those, Nick? I think it would be
in a minute.
I'm chomping at the bit, wanting to see this.
Okay, so I'll just to finalize, just to finish on the arguments and all of that. So the arguments are condition hazards. as in, sorry, dereliction, not habitable, PN Bewley, hazardous condition issues, HHSRS, and thus potential for local authority to issue a prohibition notice on that property at the time of purchase. The third one is if it's a buy-to-let, we argue that under the Homes Fitness for Habitation Act, that property isn't rentable and thus legally restricted from use for its intended use as a rentable property. So in this case, Emma, with that lovely tenant, as long as they're happy and you're keeping them sweet, then they're not going to report you. The local authority isn't going to come around and they're not going to do an inspection and they're not going to issue a prohibition notice. But if you're a landlord and you are renting out substandard property, just remember you're in a high risk situation.
So
anyway,
can I just clarify? So you said
yes.
3 things there. So 1 is a hazardous condition.
Yes.
2 is derelict conditions.
Yeah.
And 3 is whether the home is fit for habitation.
Yeah, so PN Bewley, without going into it too much, but basically PN Bewley's argument was property could never have been used as a home and it had to be demolished, which was the case. They bought it to demolish it. And therefore this idea that could never be repaired in dire condition, that was accepted. But also this other idea that if it's just not habitable, it should not be assessed as residential. There's this other layer which is legally restricted from use, and that breaks down into 2 elements, which is just generally legally restricted from use, prohibition order, and so on. And the other one is can't rent because hazardous condition issues as well. But it's a slightly different argument because what we're saying is its intended use was buy-to-let. Can't be used as a buy-to-let because it's legally restricted from use. But so you got 2 pillars to the legally restricted from use argument, which we use. One final thing to say, and then we're going to get on with property condition hazards and so on. And I will say a lot of it's quite counterintuitive, which you will see. So when we get into that. But the final thing is that if a case is procedurally correct, in other words, you ask for the right, you state the right legislation, you make the right request, you submit the right documents, then HMRC, because they operate a pay now, check later policy, then they are likely to pay, very likely to pay. And then they have 9 months in which to make an inquiry on the property into the case. And then what they look for is justification. And if they see no substantive justification, then what they'll do is they'll make an inquiry, and then you have to go and argue it. Now, the reason people use people like us is because you can, in theory, put it all together. It'll take you a while to do the case. So our typical case is 120 pages long. So it's quite a lot of work. We have a lot of admin people. I think I said 15 of us in the company. So over half are admin people. But what happens with us is our fees are on the line. So if they claw back, we pay back our fees, and thus we're going to fight it out with HMRC because that's why you have us. We're like an insurance policy.